Hey guys, welcome to another unfettered lettering tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at 5 different ways to decorate monoline script lettering. So if you've been following me for a while, you probably know that I have a monoline script workbook available where I teach how to letter in a monoline script style. You probably also know that I think this is the best place to start because it helps you learn the basic shapes and really the foundational skills that you need in order to set yourself up for success when it comes to more advanced script lettering like calligraphy styles or flourishing or bouncing and things like that. So as essential as I think monoline script is as a lettering style, I also understand that it can get a little bit boring if you're in that beginning phase and that's all you are trying to practice right now. The very basic nature of the style can get a little bit tedious. So hopefully these 5 different ways to decorate that style lettering will help you, stay interested in the style while you're learning it, and also create more visual interest and appeal for those in your audience. So grab your iPad and we'll hop right in. Okay, so the first decoration style that we're going to talk about is using an inline. So I've got my new canvas open in Procreate, and I just lettered the word style on here in a monoline script. So I've got my colors picked out, and I'll share this palette with you in the video description. And you want to make sure that you're using any kind of monoline brush that you have. So this is one that I specifically bought and imported into Procreate, but there is a monoline brush that comes with Procreate. It's just called Monoline, or you can use any brush basically that has a consistent weight along the whole line. So one where the pressure won't change the weight of the brush, and it's just one solid shape. Okay, so I am going to take the monoline brush that I usually use, and I'm going to bring the brush size down to about 3% for my brush, so just something really small. And I'm going to create a new layer over this base copy of the word that I have. I'll name this inline just so I can keep my layers straight. And I'm going to choose this kind of cream white color. So again, I'm on my monoline brush, it's really small, and I'm just going to trace this word and try to get that really small monoline right in the middle of it. Okay, now technically we've created an inline within this red word, but this red lettering is really way too small for that inline to look good at all. That red base word is more just so that we have something to copy and use for consistency throughout these different decorations that we're going to try. So we are going to create a thicker version of the word underneath our inline layer. So I'll just name that style 1. And for this I'm going to use the dark blue color. So I've got dark blue, I'm still on my monoline brush, and I'm going to bump this up to, let's try 24%, so significantly bigger than the inline we just did. And I'm just going to go over the word again in this thicker blue monoline. So you want to make sure you stay as close as you can to following that exact thin monoline so that it looks like it's right in the center of your blue. So you can see over here it didn't quite hit the exact center, and that's okay because we're just drawing by hand, but you want to aim for that center line so that it looks like it's going right down the middle of this blue line. Okay, so now you can see that inline makes a much bigger impression because there's a significant contrast between the inline and the lettering itself. So you might want to go in at this point and take an eraser and just clean up anything that looks a little bit off. And just for some added visual interest, I'm actually going to put a background in this one. So I'll create a new layer, name it background, and I'm going to choose that red color, fill it in by just dropping that color onto my canvas, and now the lettering pops even more with that dark lettering and the really bright inline against a colorful background. That makes a pretty cool style. Okay, so that was our first way to decorate monoline lettering, is just by putting a solid inline in the middle. So another thing that we can do is create an inline out of dots instead of a solid line. So what I'm going to do for that is just to reduce the opacity of my inline layer. So I open my layers, click on this N, and move this, this bar down pretty far down so that I can still see the inline, but it's not totally opaque. And then I'll select that layer. I'll create a new one on top. I'll grab that same white color that I used for the inline, that same monoline brush. And then before, for this inline, I had it at about 3%, something really small. For the dots, I'm going to make it a little bit bigger, so maybe try about 6% and see how that looks. And what I'm going to do is create dots along this line, but leaving space in between each one. You can zoom out a little bit to see if you like that size, and I think that's going to be okay, so I'm going to keep going. This is also where if your inline the first time around, that solid one wasn't exactly centered, now that you're going around and doing the dots by hand, you can kind of fix that with the dot line. So make it more centered than your inline was if that was an issue. So once you finish doing all those dots, go into your layers panel, turn off that inline that you were sketching over. I'm going to rename this dot inline because I like to keep my layers organized. And now you can see that that has made another really cool style. It almost kind of looks like a marquee just by doing those dots along the center of your lettering. Okay, we're going to look at a few other styles now that will incorporate some shadowing and shading into your monoline lettering to give it a little bit of an interesting effect. So I'm going to group all of these together and just turn that off. And I'm going to work with this base lettering that we started with. So I'll just name this style just so we're clear. And this first decoration is really simple. I'm going to grab the yellow color from my palette, I'm still in my monoline brush, like we will be for probably this whole tutorial. And I'm going to kind of see what size this one is. So it looks like this lettering is about 10% for me. And I want to go just a little bit lower than that. So I'm going to bring this brush back down to about 6%. And that looks good. Just so it's a little bit smaller than my lettering. And what we're going to do is add a drop line to this word. So I'm going to add it to the right side of my lettering, kind of right and bottom. So you can kind of pick as if you were imagining like where a light source was coming and hitting your lettering. We're going to be shading where the shadow would fall if that light source were in a specific point. So for me, it's almost like there's a sun, there's a light source up here. It's going to be hitting the letters from this way, and I'm going to create my shadows kind of on the right underside of the letters. So let me delete that. And then all you're going to do is take that monoline brush that's a little bit smaller than your lettering and draw kind of parallel lines to that side that you identified as the side that you were going to shade. So for me, again, that's kind of bottom right. And I'm going to leave a little bit of space in between my lettering and this drop line that I'm creating. And I'm just going to go around and do that for any side of my lettering where that imaginary sunshine would not hit. You want to try to stay consistent with this spacing as much as you can too. So again, this is hand drawn, so it's not going to be perfect, but try to leave that space in between your lettering and the drop line as even as possible. Okay, and there you go. You added a drop line to your monoline lettering, which gives it a really simple but interesting effect. The next thing we're going to try is a drop shadow. So I'm going to turn this this drop line layer off after I label it. And to create a drop shadow, or what you'll hear people call an extrusion, we're going to duplicate our original lettering. So slide that layer to the left to hit duplicate. And then that bottom layer, I'm going to turn off the top one. The bottom layer I want to select, grab my dark blue, and then fill. Okay, I'm going to turn my top layer back on now, but make sure the blue layer is selected, and then I'm going to go over here to my magic wand, the adjustments menu, and I'm going to hit motion blur. And then I'm going to take my pencil and I'm going to kind of start where my lettering is and drag it down and to the right. So the way you angle your pencil after you start dragging is going to determine the angle of this extrusion or shadow that we're creating. So you can play with that until you find the angle that you like, and then you also want to find the size that you want. So I'm going to bring mine up to about 26%, and then just let go. Hit the magic wand to deselect that. And then we don't want this kind of really faded transparent shadow. We want a solid one. So I'm going to go into my layers. I'm going to select that blue layer, and I'm going to fill it a few times, still with just that dark blue color. We're just kind of filling in the space of that shadow. And so after you've gotten it to about this point, now we're going to go in and really fill in these blurred edges, because again, we want it to be a solid shadow. So I'm going to select the layer again, but this time I'm going to grab my brush. So it's still just a monoline brush, whatever you want to use, but you want to make sure it's really big. So I'm going to increase my brush size all the way, and then just start painting it in. So you can see how those blurred edges are getting filled in. And we're getting a bit of a harder line around the shadow rather than this really kind of fuzzy, transparent one. Okay, once you feel like your shadow is pretty opaque and all the edges are looking good, deselect it, and then use the cursor icon to grab the whole thing. And then you're going to drag it down in that same direction that you used to create the motion blur. So that's down and to the right for me. And you are just trying to match up the tops of your letters with the top of that shadow. So you just want to check your edges and make sure everything looks like it's lined up okay. And for me, that looks good. So I'm going to deselect it. And there you go. You've got monoline lettering, but we added this extrusion or this drop shadow to it to give it a little bit of depth and interest and dimension. Okay, for this last style that we're going to look at, we're going to keep this drop shadow or this extrusion, but we're going to add shading to it. And because I did this in a pretty dark color, I'm going to change up the colors a little bit so that we can see the shading really well once we apply it to the extrusion. So I'm going to go in and create a background layer, which I'm going to use the dark blue for my background. And then I'm going to go in and I will select my red lettering that I have, create a new layer, choose this white color, select a new layer, and hit fill. Now the reason I didn't just fill that red layer is because sometimes when you do that, if you look really closely, there's still a little bit of that red color that stays behind, usually like in the edges, the pixely edges of your drawing, and it just gives it this little hint of color that you don't really want. So that's why I typically, if I'm recoloring something, I'll create it on a new layer like that. And then, of course, we have that extrusion down there, but it's lost because it's the same color as the background now. So let's recolor that one as well. So we're going to select it, create a new layer right above. I'm going to choose this teal color and then hit fill layer on the new layer. And we can turn that off, the old blue extrusion. So I'm going to name this Teal, Teal extrusion, and this one we'll just call style again. So what we want to do is we want to add shading to our extrusion layer. So for this one, I'm going to pretend like there's a light source coming from this opposite side as we used before for the extrusion. So we're going to pretend like light is coming from here. So anything kind of on this side or along the bottom will not see that light. And we're going to make this just a darker version of the teal that's already used for the extrusion. So to do that, first let me erase that sun. To do that, we're going to change this layers blend mode. So you tap on the N, scroll this down until you see multiply. And now when we use this teal color on top of the teal color itself, it's going to be darker than it actually is on its own. That's because it's multiplying, so that teal on top of the other teal is making it like twice as dark. So let's get rid of that again. And we're going to go through, and like I said, we're going to pretend like the sun is coming from this direction, and all of this stuff at the bottom and coming up on left sides is going to be dark. So I'm going to go through, and first I'm just going to shade the bottoms of these extrusions. So I'm on my new layer. I'm going to make this a clipping mask so that it only applies to any area where that teal extrusion exists. So what that means is I can't draw outside of that teal extrusion. It's only clipping my drawing to where the teal extrusion already exists. So there's nothing here, but there is something here. It's just easier so you don't have to get the lines exactly correct as you're kind of drawing this. It's going to automatically fit them to that teal extrusion. So I'm going to start, like I said, by just going over the bottom areas of all these different letters and just shading that in by dropping the color in there. For anything that's rounded like this, I'm going to just kind of pick a point where I think the shadow might stop. So again, light's coming from this direction. I think, maybe about this amount of that extrusion would receive light and the rest would kind of be darker. So it's up to you kind of how much shading you want to put on each letter, kind of how much you want to exaggerate the lighting and the shading. Okay, so I've added the shading just to the bottom of each layer, of each letter, and now I need to go back through and see where else there would be dark areas if the light were coming from this direction. So look kind of inside each letter now and see where the areas would be in shadow. So for example, in this S, this little curve would be in shadow. Maybe the light would hit right in there, but not the top because it's covered. This part is the underside of this stroke, so that's going to be dark. And up at the top, probably this top area would be dark, but maybe the light would come in a little bit and just hit that space right there. And so same thing here where this connects. That space is going to be dark and in shadow. Underneath the crossbar of my T will be dark. And so you'll just go through the rest of your word like that, picking out areas where you think there might be a little bit of shading and adding that darker color. One thing to keep in mind is to try your best to keep the same angle. So for example here, this angle of that dark shadow matches this angle of the shadow in here. So kind of the lines where they end should be at the same angle. So I think that looks pretty good. There are some, other adjustments we could make if we want to be a little more precise about it. But overall, I think that gives a good sense of dimension and depth to this word. So we just added some dark areas to the extrusion where we assume light would not hit if it were coming from a certain angle. And that really takes this really simple monoline lettering to a whole nother level. So we can go through and let's organize this real quick. Okay, so we started with a really simple monoline script version of the word style. We added a solid inline to give it this effect. We went over that inline with dots to give this more fun kind of marquee effect. We added just a simple line on the right and bottom sides to give it this drop line effect. We extended the lettering down and to the right to give it this 3D extrusion to make it look a little bit more like it's popping off the page. And then we added shading to the extrusion. We put it on this darker background to make it really look like it's popping off the page and give it a more interesting and dimensional effect. So those are 5 easy ways to make your monoline script look a little more interesting, give it a little bit more fun decoration, and to level up your lettering skills. Hope you enjoyed this video. If you have any questions or comments or ideas for more tutorials, please leave those in the comments below. Thanks for watching!